The day the ancient dragons knelt before him, Mason Reed's hands were still caked with dried mud from cleaning the royal stables. Their massive scaled heads lowered in unison, a sight no human had witnessed in over 8 millennia of recorded history. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I always love chatting with you, and it really helps support the channel. Also, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Mason had spent 17 years of his life as nothing but a stable boy in the kingdom of Tylon, sleeping on hay bales and dreaming of adventures he believed would never come. But as the shadows of the 7 great dragons fell across the royal courtyard that spring morning, everything changed. Mason had started his morning like any other, rising before dawn to begin his duties. The royal stables housed 36 purebred horses, each worth more than Mason could hope to earn in a lifetime. He took pride in his work, despite the constant reminders from the knights and nobles that he was nothing but a servant, born to the lowest class in Talon's rigid hierarchy. "Boy, you missed a spot!" Knight Commander Garrett barked as he inspected the stables, deliberately knocking over a bucket of clean water with his boot. "Clean it again." "Obid." He smirked at Mason's frustration before walking away, his polished armor catching the early morning light. Mason bit his tongue, knowing that responding would only make things worse. At 17, he was tall for his age, but still lanky, with sandy brown hair that fell across his eyes when he worked. His clothes were patched in dozens of places, but he kept them as clean as possible, one of the few dignities he could maintain. "Don't let him get to you," said Reese, the daughter of the royal falconer. She was 16, with fierce eyes and a practical braid that kept her auburn hair from her work. "My father says Garrett was born with a silver spoon, so far up his—" "Reese!" Mason laughed despite himself. She shrugged, unapologetic. "Just telling the truth. Anyway, have you heard? The King's scouts have reported dragon sightings in the northern mountains." "Dragons?" Mason paused in his work. "But they haven't been seen in Talon for generations. That's what makes it so strange. Father says the entire castle is on alert. The king has called his war council." Dragons were more than just creatures in their world. They were ancient beings of immense power, older than the kingdom itself. In the tales Mason had heard as a child, dragons were described as forces of nature given flesh and will, capable of both tremendous destruction and inexplicable wisdom. But they had retreated from human land centuries ago, becoming little more than legends and symbols on royal crests. What would bring them back now? Mason wondered aloud. Reese had no answer, but both soon forgot the conversation as their daily duties consumed them. By midday, Mason was leading horses to the paddock for exercise when the first shadow passed overhead. At first, he thought it was a cloud, until he noticed the stable master and the other workers looking skyward with expressions of terror. Mason followed their gaze and felt his heart stutter. The creature was massive, easily the size of the entire stable complex, with scales that shifted from deep emerald to midnight blue as it moved through the air. Its wings created wind currents strong enough to flatten the grass in the paddock. "Get inside!" the stable master shouted, but before anyone could move, 5 more shadows joined the first. 6 dragons circled the castle, their wingspans blocking the sun and casting the courtyard into premature twilight. Guards shouted orders and warning bells rang across the kingdom, but Mason stood transfixed. The horses in his care whinnied and pulled at their leads, their instincts screaming danger, but Mason couldn't move. The largest dragon, scales the color of burnished copper that caught the sunlight like flames, descended first. The ground shook as it landed in the central courtyard, its massive clawed feet crushing the ornamental gardens that royal gardeners had spent decades perfecting. The other dragons followed, each taking positions around the perimeter of the castle. Their arrival created chaos among the castle staff and guards, many fleeing in terror while others froze in place. Mason should have run. He should have hidden with the others, But something about the copper dragon's eyes, ancient, intelligent, and somehow searching, kept him rooted to the spot. The dragon surveyed the courtyard, its gaze passing over scrambling nobles and guards, until those massive eyes locked with Mason's. In that moment, something impossible happened. Mason heard a voice in his mind, deep and resonant like stone grinding against stone. "At last," the voice said, "we have found you, dragon speaker." Mason nearly fell to his knees. The dragon was speaking to him, not with sounds, but directly into his thoughts. Before he could process this, the other dragons turned their attention to him as well, and more voices filled his mind. "The bloodline endures," came a feminine voice from a silver-scaled dragon. "He is untrained, unaware," said another, sounding doubtful. "But he is the one," insisted the copper dragon. "The signs are unmistakable." Mason found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What? What are you talking about?" By now, the king's guards had organized themselves into defensive formations. Archers knocked arrows along the castle walls, and knights in full armor approached with spears and shields. King Harlow himself emerged onto a balcony, his royal guard surrounding him. "Dragons of the ancient realms," the king called out, his voice carrying the authority of 20 years of rule. "Why have you broken the ancient pact and entered the lands of men?" The copper dragon turned its massive head toward the king, but made no sound that humans could hear. Mason, however, heard the response clearly in his mind. "We come for the dragon speaker. The time of reckoning approaches, and he must be prepared." They're here for me," Mason said, his voice stronger now. Several nearby guards looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. King Harlow frowned. "What trickery is this? Dragons have not communicated with mankind since the Great Severance." The copper dragon lowered its head until its enormous eye was level with the balcony. "You hear nothing, because you are not meant to hear, King of Stone Nests. Only the dragon speaker can bridge our worlds now." Mason felt something pulling him forward. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him past the line of guards and into the open courtyard. Knight Commander Garrett grabbed his arm. "Get back to the stables, boy. This is no place for servants." Mason met his eyes with a confidence he'd never felt before. "Let go of me." Something in his voice, or perhaps his eyes, made Garrett's hand fall away. Mason continued walking until he stood directly before the copper dragon. Up close, the creature was even more magnificent. Each scale was the size of a dinner plate, layered perfectly over the next, and heat radiated from its body like a blacksmith's forge. "I don't understand," Mason said, speaking directly to the dragon. "I'm nobody, just a stable boy." The dragon lowered its massive head until it was mere feet from Mason. Its nostrils flared, taking in his scent, and Mason could see his own reflection in its pupil. "You are Dragon Speaker, last of an ancient bloodline. Your ancestors once stood between our kind and yours, maintaining balance and peace. When that line was thought broken, we retreated from the world of men. But the blood has resurfaced in you, and not a moment too soon." "What bloodline? My parents were servants. They died in the fever outbreak when I was 4. They raised you, cared for you, but they were not your birth parents." The silver dragon interjected mentally. "You were hidden for your protection." Mason's world tilted. Everything he thought he knew about himself was being challenged by creatures out of legend. And yet, something deep inside him resonated with their words. He had always felt different, set apart, though he'd attributed that to his orphan status and lowly position. "Protected from what?" he asked. "From those who would destroy the last dragon speaker before you could fulfill your destiny," the copper dragon answered. "The same forces that now threaten both our kinds with extinction." By now, the king had descended to the courtyard, surrounded by his guard. The royal wizard, Magister Thorn, accompanied him, his staff glowing with prepared spells. "What is happening here?" King Harlow demanded. "Boy, explain yourself." Mason turned to face his king, a man he'd only glimpsed from afar before today. "Your Majesty, the dragons say they've come for me. They say I'm something called a dragon speaker." Magister Thorn pushed forward, his ancient face suddenly pale. "Impossible. The dragon speaker bloodline was extinguished during the Mage Wars, over 3 centuries ago." "You are mistaken, spell weaver." The copper dragon's voice boomed in Mason's mind, and he found himself translating automatically. "The dragon says you're wrong," Mason relayed. "The bloodline survived." The wizard's eyes widened. "You can hear them? Truly hear them?" Mason nodded. The king looked between the stable boy and his royal wizard, confusion evident on his face. "Magister Thorn, explain this. What is a dragon speaker?" The old wizard leaned heavily on his staff. In the ancient days, before the kingdoms of men were established, there existed individuals who could communicate with dragonkind. They served as intermediaries, diplomats between our species. The last known dragon speaker was killed during the Mage Wars, when the dark wizard Corvus sought to harness dragon magic for himself. As the wizard spoke, images flashed through Mason's mind, memories that weren't his own. He saw figures standing before dragons, much like he was now, felt the weight of responsibility and the deep connection they shared with the ancient creatures. "The dragons say a threat is coming," Mason said. "Something that endangers both dragons and humans." Magister Thorn's expression darkened. "What threat?" Before Mason could relay the question, a new shadow fell across the courtyard. This one was different, darker, colder. A 7th dragon descended, its scales black as a moonless night, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Unlike the others, whose movements were graceful despite their size, this dragon's flight seemed labored, unnatural. "Noctis!" The copper dragon's voice was tight in Mason's mind. "He has been taken." The black dragon landed with a crash that cracked the stone courtyard. Guards raised their weapons, but the king held up his hand, keeping them at bay. Mason felt dread emanating from the 6 dragons around him. "What's wrong with it?" he asked the copper dragon. "Not it. Him. Noctis was the eldest of our council, the wisest among us, but he has been corrupted." The black dragon's eyes fixed on Mason, but unlike the others, these eyes held no wisdom or recognition, only hunger and malice. When it spoke in his mind, the voice was distorted, as if multiple entities were speaking at once. So small, this last dragon speaker. So fragile. "My master will be pleased when I bring him your heart." Mason stepped back involuntarily. "Who is your master?" The black dragon's mouth opened, revealing teeth like obsidian daggers. From deep in its throat came an actual sound, a hissing laugh that everyone in the courtyard could hear. "The void approaches, little speaker, the hunger between worlds that devours magic itself. My master has feasted on countless realms, and now he turns his gaze to yours. Dragons first, with their ancient power, and then all else." The copper dragon moved with surprising speed, positioning itself between Mason and the corrupted Noctis. "He has been consumed by the void. There is nothing left of Noctis within that shell." The black dragon lunged forward, jaws snapping at the copper dragon's neck. The courtyard erupted into chaos as the 2 massive creatures collided, guards scattered, and the king was rushed back into the castle. The other dragons took to the air, circling but not engaging. "Why aren't they helping?" Mason shouted over the roars and crashes. "They cannot," came the strained reply from the copper dragon as it fought. "To touch one corrupted by the void is to risk corruption yourself. I am eldest after Noctis. I alone might resist long enough." Mason watched in horror as the 2 dragons battled. The copper dragon was powerful, but the black dragon moved with unnatural speed and viciousness. Black ichor dripped from its jaws, sizzling when it touched the ground, and wherever it bit the copper dragon, the bright scales darkened. "It's infecting him," Mason realized aloud. Magister Thorn appeared at his side, pulling him away from the fight. "Come away, boy. There's nothing you can do." But something deep within Mason rebelled at the thought of running. The copper dragon was fighting, dying, to protect him. These creatures had searched for him, had recognized something in him that he didn't understand himself. He couldn't abandon them. "There must be something I can do," he insisted. "If I'm really this dragon speaker, there must be a way to help." The wizard hesitated. The old text spoke of the connection between dragon speakers and dragons as something mystical, beyond mere communication. A sharing of essence, but without training. Mason didn't wait to hear more. He broke free from the wizard's grip and ran toward the battling dragons, ignoring the shouts behind him. The copper dragon was weakening, black corruption spreading across its scales where the dark dragon had made contact. "Stop!" Mason shouted, both aloud and with his mind. The black dragon paused, its attention diverted momentarily. It was enough for the copper dragon to retreat a few steps, wounded but still standing. "You cannot command me, dragon speaker," the corrupted dragon hissed in his mind. "Your power is untapped, untrained." "Maybe," Mason agreed, standing his ground despite his racing heart, "but I'm still the dragon speaker, and you're still a dragon." He didn't know where the words came from or the certainty behind them, but as he spoke, he felt something stir within him, a power he'd never known he possessed. The corrupted dragon felt it too. He could see the flicker of uncertainty in those malice-filled eyes. "You are nothing," the black dragon snarled, but there was doubt in its mental voice. Mason stepped closer, feeling the copper dragon's presence supporting him mentally. "I am the dragon speaker, blood of the ancient mediators, bridge between worlds." With each declaration, the power within him grew stronger. "And I say you do not belong here." He reached out his hand, not touching the corrupted dragon but directing his newfound energy toward it. The black dragon shrieked, a sound of both rage and fear, as tendrils of light emerged from Mason's extended palm, wrapping around the creature's form. The effort drained Mason, like nothing he'd ever experienced. It felt as if his very life force was flowing out through his hand, combating the darkness that had consumed Noctis. His vision blurred, his knees weakened, but still he maintained the connection. "Mason!" Reese's voice came from somewhere behind him. "Hold on!" Her voice anchored him, reminded him of who he was, not just the dragon speaker of legend, but Mason Reed, who had survived orphanhood and servitude through sheer determination. He gritted his teeth and pushed harder. The corrupted dragon thrashed against the bonds of light, but they held firm. Slowly, patches of the black scales began to flake away, revealing the original silver-white coloration beneath. The dragon's struggles weakened as more of the corruption fell away. "Impossible!" The distorted voice raged in Mason's mind. "You cannot undo what the void has claimed." "Watch me!" Mason challenged, though the words came out as little more than a gasp. With one final surge of effort, Mason poured everything he had into the cleansing light. The black dragon reared back, its head thrown toward the sky, and emitted a shriek that shattered windows throughout the castle. A cloud of darkness erupted from its body, hovering momentarily above the courtyard like a storm cloud before dissipating into nothing. Where the corrupted beast had stood, a much smaller dragon remained, still enormous by human standards, but noticeably diminished. Its scales were no longer midnight black, but a translucent silver white that caught the light like opals. It collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, but free of the darkness that had possessed it. Mason swayed on his feet, his energy completely depleted. As his consciousness faded, he was aware of the copper dragon moving toward him, its thoughts filled with awe and concern. "In all our histories," it said in his mind, "no dragon speaker has ever purged the void corruption. You are more than we hoped for, Mason Reed." Then the world went dark. Mason awoke in a room he didn't recognize. Gone was his pallet of straw in the stable loft. Instead, he lay on a four-poster bed with silk sheets and velvet curtains. For a moment, he thought he must be dreaming, but the aches throughout his body felt all too real. "He's awake," came Reese's voice, and suddenly she was at his bedside, her practical demeanor giving way to evident relief. "You complete idiot! What were you thinking, confronting that thing?" Mason tried to sit up but fell back against the pillows, his muscles protesting. "Where am I?" "The east wing of the castle," came another voice. Magister Thorn entered the room, looking at Mason with newfound respect. "These are the traditional quarters of the royal advisors." "Why am I here?" Mason asked, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Because, young man," came the king's voice as he entered behind the wizard, "it seems you are far more than a stable boy." Mason struggled again to sit up, this time succeeding with Reese's help. He tried to bow his head to the king, but Harlow waved away the gesture. "No need for that. Not from the man who saved my kingdom from a threat I didn't even understand." The king approached the bed. "The dragons remain, circling the castle. They refuse to leave without you, though they've assured us, through Magister Thorn's limited dragon speech spell, that they mean no harm to Talon." "How long have I been unconscious?" Mason asked. 3 days, Reese answered. "The healers weren't sure you'd wake at all. Whatever you did out there nearly killed you." Mason closed his eyes, remembering the surge of power that had flowed through him. "I don't understand what happened. It was like I knew what to do without knowing how I knew." "Ancestral memory," Magister Thorn suggested. "The knowledge of dragon speakers past, dormant in your blood until needed." "But who am I really?" Mason asked. "The dragons said my parents, the ones who raised me, weren't my birth parents." The old wizard and the king exchanged glances. It was the king who spoke. "There are things you should know, Mason Reed. Or perhaps I should call you by your true name, Mason Draconis, last descendant of the royal house of Draconis, which ruled these lands before my own ancestors." Mason stared at the king in shock. "That's impossible. I'm no one. I clean horse stalls." "You were hidden in plain sight," Magister Thorn explained. "When the last known scions of House Draconis were killed in a raid 17 years ago, rumor spread that the pregnant queen had managed to birth her child before dying. King Harlow's father ordered a search, not to harm the child, but to protect it. My father recognized the importance of the Draconis bloodline, even if its connection to the dragons had been forgotten by most," King Harlow continued. "When no child was found, it was assumed the rumors were false, but it seems the baby was spirited away and placed with a servant family." "Why?" Mason asked. "Why hide me among servants?" "Protection through obscurity," the wizard said. "Who would look for a royal heir in the stables? And it worked for 17 years, until the dragons sensed the awakening of your abilities." Mason tried to process this information. He wasn't just Mason the stable boy. He was the last member of a royal house older than the current kingdom, a house connected to dragons. The corrupted dragon, Noctis. He spoke of a master, something called the Void. Magister Thorn's expression grew grave. "Yes, the dragons have explained some of this. The Void is not a person but an entity, a force of anti-magic that exists between dimensions. It consumes magical energy, and there is no greater repository of magic in our world than dragons. They believe this Void has found a way to breach into our world," the king added. "The corruption of Noctis was just the beginning. They need you, as Dragon Speaker, to help them combat this threat." "Me? But I don't know anything about being a Dragon Speaker." "I don't know how I did what I did in the courtyard. Yet you did it," Reese pointed out. "You did something even the dragons thought impossible." A guard appeared at the doorway, bowing to the king. "Your Majesty, the Copper Dragon requests the Dragon Speaker's presence in the courtyard. It says the matter is urgent." King Harlow looked to Mason. "Are you strong enough to meet with them?" Mason wasn't sure, but he nodded anyway. With Reese's help, he climbed out of bed. Someone had dressed him in fine clothes while he slept, a tunic of deep blue with silver embroidery that he would never have dared touch as a stable boy. "Those are the colors of House Draconis," the king noted, seeing Mason's surprise at the garments. "Blue for the sky, silver for dragon scales." Mason made his way slowly through the castle, supported by Reese, with the king and Magister Thorn following. Guards and servants stopped to stare as they passed. Word had spread about the stable boy, who had communicated with dragons and cleansed one of dark magic. In the courtyard, the 7 dragons waited. The copper one stood in the center, its wounds from the battle visibly healing. Beside it, the restored Noctis rested, still weakened but free of corruption. As Mason appeared, all 7 dragons, including Noctis, lowered their massive heads in a gesture of respect. "They're bowing to you," Reese whispered, awe in her voice. "Why?" Mason asked, directing the question to the copper dragon. "Because you have done what no dragon speaker before you has accomplished," the dragon replied in his mind. "You have purged the void's corruption and restored one of our eldest. In all our long history, this was thought impossible. I just did what felt right." "That instinct is part of your gift," the silver dragon added, "but it will need training and refinement if we are to face what comes." Mason looked around at the gathered dragons, the king, the wizard, and Reese still supporting him at his side. 3 days ago, he had been mucking out stalls, invisible to all but a few fellow servants. Now, ancient creatures of legend bowed to him, and a king addressed him as royalty. "What comes next?" he asked the copper dragon. "War," came the solemn reply. "The void has tasted our world and found it rich with magic to consume. What happened to Noctis was merely a scout, a test of our defenses. More will come, and we must be prepared." "And you need me to help fight this war? I'm not a warrior. I've never even held a sword." "You are more than a warrior, Mason Draconis. You are the bridge between dragons and mankind. At a time when both must stand together or fall separately. You have power you have only begun to discover." Mason thought about everything he'd learned, about his heritage, about the threat facing their world, about the power that had awakened within him. He thought about his life as a stable boy, the dreams of adventure he'd never believed would come true. Now, adventure had found him, though far more dangerous than his boyhood fantasies. "I don't know if I can be what you need me to be," he admitted, "but I'm willing to try." The copper dragon's approval washed over him like a warm breeze. "That is all anyone can ask, young dragon speaker, and it is more than enough to begin." King Harlow stepped forward. "If our kingdoms must prepare for war against this void, then House Silvare stands with House Draconis and the dragons." Magister Thorn nodded his agreement. "The Order of Mages will research this threat and prepare our defenses." "And I'll make sure he doesn't do anything stupid again," Reese added, squeezing Mason's arm. Mason looked at each of them in turn, then back to the assembled dragons. The path ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger. The burden of his newly discovered identity and purpose weighed heavily on his shoulders. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't alone. He had allies, powerful ones. "When do we start?" he asked. The copper dragon's mental voice carried a mixture of approval and urgency. "Now, dragon speaker, we start now." As if to emphasize the point, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the clear sky, but Mason and the dragons knew it wasn't thunder. Somewhere, the barrier between worlds was weakening. The void was testing its way through. The stable boy who had become a dragon speaker took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on. The ancient dragons had bowed their heads to him, not out of blind reverence, but out of recognition of what he could become. Now it was up to him to live up to that potential. With the dragons at his side and his newfound allies supporting him, Mason took his first step on the path from stable boy to the leader their world would need in the dark days ahead. The first attack came 3 days later, while Mason was still learning the basics of his abilities. He sat cross-legged on the castle's eastern tower, facing the copper dragon Ignis. The massive creature perched on the battlements, wings tucked close to its body. "Focus on the connection between us," Ignis instructed in Mason's mind. "Feel the tether that binds dragon speaker to dragon." Mason closed his eyes, concentrating on the warm presence emanating from Ignis. Since awakening his powers, he had discovered that he could sense each dragon differently. Ignis was warmth, Noctis a cool breeze, the silver dragon Lunara felt like moonlight on water. "I can feel it," Mason confirmed. "But how do I use it?" The bond allows more than communication. At its strongest, it permits sharing of strength, of senses, even of magic. Your ancestors could see through our eyes, fly with our wings, while their bodies remained earthbound. Mason tried to imagine such a connection, and felt a dizzying shift in his perception. Suddenly he was looking down at himself, a small figure sitting on the tower stones. "I can see through your eyes," he gasped. "Good," Ignis approved. "Now reach deeper, feel the fire at my core." Mason extended his awareness along the bond between them. Beyond Ignis's thoughts, he felt something else, a wellspring of heat and power, ancient and primal, dragon magic. Before Mason could ask more, Ignis's attention shifted sharply toward the northern horizon. "Something approaches, something wrong." The dragon launched from the tower, joined moments later by the other 6 dragons. Mason ran to the edge, straining to see what had alarmed them. At first, he saw nothing unusual in the clear blue sky. Then, a dark smudge appeared on the northern horizon, moving too fast to be a natural cloud. "Void spawn," came Noctis's grim voice in Mason's mind. "The corruption that took me has found physical form." Mason reached out mentally to all 7 dragons. "What do we do?" "We fight," Ignis answered simply, "and you, dragon speaker, must coordinate our defense with the humans. The void will target you specifically. It fears what you represent." Warning bells rang throughout the castle as lookouts spotted the approaching threat. Mason raced down the tower stairs to the main courtyard where King Harlow was organizing the castle's defense. "It's something they call void spawn," Mason explained quickly. "Creatures of anti-magic." Magister Thorn joined them. "We've found references in the ancient texts. The void creates servants from the corrupted essence of magical beings it has consumed in other realms." "How do we fight them?" the king demanded. "With difficulty," the wizard admitted. "Magic has limited effect on creatures of anti-magic. Steel and fire are more reliable." "Then steel and fire they shall face," King Harlow declared, turning to Knight Commander Garrett. Mason noted that Garrett looked at him differently now. Gone was the contempt, replaced by a wary respect. The knight saluted the king, then surprisingly inclined his head to Mason before rushing to carry out his orders. The dark cloud was close enough now that Mason could make out individual shapes within it. Writhing, twisted forms with too many limbs and features that seemed to shift and change as they moved. The town below the castle erupted into chaos as citizens fled toward the castle gates. Mason watched in horror, knowing the gates couldn't accommodate everyone in time. "Ignis," he called mentally. "The townspeople." "We see," the dragon responded. 3 dragons broke formation and positioned themselves between the fleeing humans and the approaching void spawn, forming a living barrier. The remaining 4 dragons engaged the front of the swarm, unleashing their breath weapons in unison. Dozens of void spawn disintegrated, but hundreds more pressed forward. Up close, the creatures were even more disturbing, vaguely humanoid, but with skin that seemed to absorb light, creating the impression of moving holes in reality. Where they touched buildings, wood rotted and stone crumbled. "They consume the life energy of everything they touch," Noctis warned. "Do not let them contact human flesh." The void spawn split into smaller groups, targeting different sections of the town simultaneously. The dragons were forced to separate, their effectiveness diminished. "They're acting with intelligence," Mason realized. "Someone or something is directing them." Ignis's mental voice was strained as he fought. "The void itself, it learns, adapts. It has consumed countless worlds before ours." "We cannot win through attrition," Noctis observed grimly. "We must find the source, the breach through which they enter our world." "How?" Mason asked, desperation creeping into his thoughts. It was Lunara who answered. "Through you, dragon speaker. Your ancestors could extend their awareness to the spaces between worlds where magic flows. If you can locate the breach, we might seal it." "I don't know how to do that," Mason protested. "You must try," Ignis insisted, "or this is merely the first of endless attacks." Magister Thorn considered for a moment. "The old texts speak of dragon speakers entering a state of deep communion with multiple dragons simultaneously. A dangerous practice. It strained the human mind to channel so much draconic awareness." "But it might work?" "It might," the wizard allowed. "But Mason, attempting this without proper training could destroy your mind." Mason looked out at the battle raging over the town. The dragons were tiring. He could feel their exhaustion through their mental connection. "We don't have a choice," he decided. As they hurried through the castle, Mason found Reese organizing the refugee townspeople in the Great Hall. "Where are you going?" she demanded, catching his arm. "To try something dangerous," he admitted, "but necessary." She studied his face for a moment, then pressed something into his palm, a small carving of a horse that he had made himself during long winter nights in the stable. "For luck," she said simply, "and to remind you who you are, not just who you're supposed to be." At the top of the highest tower, Magister Thorn drew a circle of power. "Sit in the center," he instructed Mason. "The circle will help stabilize the energies, though not completely." Mason settled cross-legged in the center. He closed his eyes and extended his awareness to all 7 dragons simultaneously, inviting them in rather than simply connecting. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. 7 different perspectives flooded his mind, 7 sets of sensory inputs, 7 ancient intelligences suddenly intermingled with his own. Mason clutched the wooden horse carving, focusing on its familiar shape as an anchor. Gradually, the chaotic input resolved into something more manageable, a composite awareness greater than the sum of its parts. He saw the magical currents that flowed through the land like rivers, saw the bright sparks of life energy in every living thing, saw the dark void spawn as tears in the fabric of reality, and as his awareness expanded further, he began to perceive the boundaries of their world. "There," he whispered, "northeast, beyond the mountains. Something is wrong there." Through the dragon's enhanced vision, he could see it clearly now, a pulsing darkness in the fabric of reality, like a wound that oozed corruption. Void spawn emerged from it continuously. "The breach," Noctis confirmed. "The void has created an anchor point in our world." "Can we close it?" Mason asked. "Not from here," Ignis answered. "One must approach the breach directly to seal it." "Then we go there," Mason decided, already rising to his feet. "The journey would take days," Magister Thorn protested. "The kingdom would fall before you reached it." "We don't need to travel conventionally," Mason realized. "Dragons can fold space for short distances, what they call the wing-between step. With all 7 working together, it would require immense energy," Lunara cautioned, "and perfect coordination." "Which we now have through me," Mason pointed out. In the courtyard, King Harlow assembled a strike team of his 12 best knights, including Knight Commander Garrett. Magister Thorn and his senior apprentices joined them, carrying magical artifacts. The 7 dragons descended to the courtyard, forming a circle around the humans. They began to hum, a vibration that resonated with the magical energies of the world. Through his connection with them, Mason could feel their power building, flowing into him from all sides. "Now!" he gasped, extending his arms. The world around them blurred, colors smearing like wet paint. Then, with a thunderous crack, they arrived at a rocky plateau high in the northern mountains. The breach hung in the air before them, a tier in reality about 20 feet across. Through it, Mason could see nothing. Not darkness, but the absence of everything. Void spawn emerged from it in a steady stream. "How do we seal it?" King Harlow asked. Mason reached out through his connection to the dragons. "Those black crystals clustered around the base of the breach are the anchor points. The void corrupted natural magic crystals to create a foothold." As if responding to their presence, a new form emerged from the breach, larger than the void spawn, resembling a knight in black armor, but where its face should be was only a swirling vortex of nothingness. "Void Sentinel," Noctis identified. "A guardian created specifically to protect the breach." More sentinels followed, forming a protective line before the crystal formation. "We need a plan," the king said, as his knights formed a defensive position. "The crystals are the key," Mason explained. "If we can cleanse them as I cleansed Noctis, the breach will collapse." "Can you do that for multiple crystals?" Magister Thorn asked doubtfully. "The effort of cleansing one dragon nearly killed you." "Not alone," Mason admitted. "But with all 7 dragons channeling their power through me, and with your mages reinforcing the spell work—" He left the thought unfinished. "We have no choice but to try," King Harlow decided. The battle began. The knights and dragons engaged the sentinels, while Magister Thorn and his apprentices formed a protective circle around Mason. Mason sat at the center, once again reaching out to all 7 dragons simultaneously. Through their combined awareness, he could see the true nature of the corrupted crystals, once natural conduits of the world's magic, now twisted to serve as anchors for the void. He shaped the dragon's power into a cleansing force and directed it toward the first crystal. Immediately, he felt resistance, the void itself pushing back against his probe, a cold malevolence that sought to corrupt anything it touched. "There's someone in the void," he said through gritted teeth. "I can feel its attention on me." "The void is sentient after a fashion," Noctis explained. "A collective consciousness formed from all it has consumed." With tremendous effort, Mason cleansed the first crystal. The breach shuddered, contracting slightly. The void's presence roared in silent fury, redoubling its attack on Mason's mind. One by one, Mason cleansed the crystals, each requiring more effort than the last. By the 4th, blood trickled from his nose and ears, his body struggling to channel so much power. The battle around them intensified. Knights fell to the void sentinels' weapons. The dragons fought magnificently, but were gradually pushed back towards the ritual circle. Only one crystal remained, but it was different from the others. It pulsed with malevolent purpose, a direct conduit to the void's consciousness. As Mason prepared to cleanse it, a humanoid figure, composed entirely of the nothing substance of the void, emerged from the breach, an avatar of the void itself. "Dragon Speaker," the avatar said, its voice like the absence of sound somehow made audible. "Last of your kind, why do you resist? The consumption of your world is inevitable." "The final crystal contains a fragment of the void itself," the avatar continued. "Cleanse it if you can, but know that touching the pure void with your mind will destroy you utterly." Mason looked around at the embattled defenders, the wounded knights, the exhausted mages, the struggling dragons. They had given everything for this chance. "Ignis," he called mentally, "is it possible for me to transfer the corruption from the crystal to myself? Then have you cleanse me as I cleansed Noctis." The copper dragon's concern flooded their connection. "Theoretically, yes. But the risk is immense. The cleansing might destroy you along with the corruption." Do we have any other choice? A moment of solemn consideration passed between all 7 dragons. No, Ignis finally admitted. Drawing a deep breath, Mason gathered every scrap of power the dragons could provide. Instead of trying to cleanse the crystal, he created a channel between it and himself, a pathway for the corruption to follow, drawn by the living energy of his own body. The effect was immediate and excruciating. Darkness flowed into him like liquid ice, spreading through his veins and into his mind. The void began to consume him from within. But Mason had one advantage: experience. He had cleansed Noctis, had felt how the corruption worked. Now, instead of fighting it directly, he contained it, creating mental barriers to keep it concentrated. "Now!" he screamed, both aloud and mentally. All 7 dragons responded as one, channeling their combined power, not at the crystal, but at Mason himself. Magister Thorn and his apprentices redirected their spellwork, reinforcing Mason's barriers, helping him contain the corruption long enough for the dragon's cleansing power to take effect. The void avatar shrieked as the final crystal reverted to its natural state. The breach contracted violently, pulling the avatar back toward it as its anchor in the world failed. Mason barely registered these developments. His entire being was consumed with the battle raging inside him, the void's corruption fighting against the dragon's cleansing power, with his own consciousness caught in between. Through the haze of agony, he became aware of a new presence in his mind. Not dragon, not human, but something else. A warmth that felt like home. "Hold on, Mason," came Reese's voice, though she was miles away in the castle. "Just hold on." The wooden horse carving in his hand glowed with a soft light. Through it somehow, Reese had formed a connection to him, adding her uniquely human strength to the mix. It was the element he needed, not just dragon magic, but human resilience. The stable boy who had survived against all odds, who had found joy in small moments despite his circumstances. With a final, desperate effort, Mason pushed the cleansing power directly into the heart of the corruption within him. Light and darkness collided, cancelling each other out in a release of energy that blasted outward from his body. The breach collapsed completely, the void avatar dragged back into nothingness. Its final mental scream echoed in Mason's mind. "This is not the end, Dragon Speaker. We will return." Then it was gone, the mountains suddenly quiet. Mason lay on his back, barely conscious but somehow still himself. Ignis's massive head appeared above him. "You did it, Mason. The breach is sealed." Is everyone? Mason couldn't complete the thought, his strength completely spent. "There were losses," the dragon acknowledged solemnly, "but many survived who would have perished had the void established its foothold." King Harlow appeared beside the dragon, his expression triumphant despite his battered state. "The day is ours, thanks to you. The world owes you a debt that can never be repaid." Mason tried to respond, but found he couldn't speak. Darkness encroached on his vision, but this time it was simply exhaustion, not corruption. As consciousness slipped away, his last thought was of Reese. 2 weeks later, Mason stood on the castle's highest tower, watching as 5 of the 7 dragons circled overhead. Noctis and a green dragon named Sylvan had already departed, beginning the task of warning other dragon conclaves about the Void's incursion. "Do you really have to go with them?" Reese asked, joining him at the parapet. Her hand found his, fingers intertwining naturally. "Not immediately," Mason answered, "but eventually, yes. The Void will return, and we need to be ready. That means finding other dragons, possibly other dragon speakers if any exist." Since the battle at the breach, Mason had spent most of his time recovering, his body and mind rebuilding themselves after the strain of channeling so much power. King Harlow had formally recognized him as Lord Mason Draconis, restoring lands and titles that had been dormant for centuries. But titles meant little to Mason. What mattered was the work ahead, building bridges between humans and dragons, preparing defenses against the void's inevitable return. "I'll come back," he promised Rhys, squeezing her hand. "This is home, after all." Ignis landed on the tower with surprising delicacy for such a massive creature. "It is time, young dragon speaker. The Eastern dragons grow restless. They must hear your voice, see your power for themselves." Mason nodded. "I'm ready." He turned to Rhys. "Wait for me?" "Always," she replied with a small smile. "Just try not to take too long. The stables aren't the same without you complaining about the mud." Mason laughed, then embraced her tightly. When they separated, he approached Ignis, who lowered his massive head. With practiced ease, Mason climbed onto the dragon's neck, settling between two enormous copper scales. "Remember who you are, Mason Reed," Rhys called as Ignis prepared to take flight. "Not just the dragon speaker, not just Lord Draconis. Remember the stable boy too." Mason patted the pocket where he kept the wooden horse carving. "How could I forget? It's the stable boy who saved the world after all." With a powerful thrust of his wings, Ignis launched into the sky. As they soared higher, Mason looked down at the castle growing smaller below, at the rebuilt towns surrounding it, at the land stretching to the horizon in all directions. His land, his people, worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. "Ready for the next adventure, dragon speaker?" Ignis asked in his mind. Mason smiled, feeling the wind on his face and the dragon's strength beneath him. "Lead the way." As they flew east, toward distant mountains, where ancient dragons waited to meet the stable boy who had become their champion, Mason felt both the weight of his responsibility and the lightness of his freedom. No longer bound by the limitations of his birth, no longer defined by the stables that had been his world for so long. Yet he would carry that stable boy with him always. His determination, his humility, his capacity for wonder in a world that had offered him so little. It was that core of humanity, not just his dragon speaker abilities, that had ultimately defeated the void. The dragons had bowed their heads to him, but in truth he knew they had bowed to the resilience of the human spirit. And that was a power worth protecting, worth fighting for in this world and all others, and that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.